The neighbors laughed the moment he started digging beneath his house, and now they understand why. A retired veteran in a red and black flannel thought he'd finally found peace in a brutal winter town by Lake Superior. But when snowstorms soaked every woodpile in the neighborhood, his loyal German shepherd refused to leave the kitchen floor, growling at a hidden trapdoor below. What lay beneath his home wasn't madness. It was a forgotten idea that would keep his fire burning while others froze. And when the coldest winter in decades arrived, that underground secret didn't just save his house. It changed how an entire community survived the cold forever. Before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from. Drop your city, state, or country in the comments. It's incredible how far these winter survival stories travel. Winter arrived early in Duluth, riding the wind off Lake Superior. A wet, biting cold that lashed wooden houses like an unseen whip and settled deep into bone and timber alike. Frank Miller stood at the edge of his small property, boots planted in half-frozen earth, listening to the wind move through bare branches and along the eaves of his aging house. At 72, Frank was no longer tall in the way young men were tall, but there was still a quiet authority in the way he carried himself. His frame was lean, hardened rather than wasted by age, shoulders still squared beneath a thick red and black buffalo plaid flannel jacket, worn thin at the cuffs. His face was sharply cut, cheekbones pronounced, jaw firm despite time, with a short, neatly trimmed gray beard that followed the lines of his mouth and chin. His eyes, deep gray, steady and unsentimental, had seen winters harsher than this, though none had ever truly grown easier. Frank lived alone on the outskirts of the city, where the lake's influence was strongest, and the snow did not merely fall, but soaked, melted, and returned again as ice. He had chosen the isolation deliberately years earlier, after retiring from military service and then burying his wife during a winter much like this one. The years in uniform had shaped him into a man who valued preparation over comfort, silence over explanation. A knee injury sustained during a cold-weather training accident had ended his career early, but it had also left him with a deep respect for the cold as something that punished carelessness without apology. He had learned to listen to weather the way other men listened to advice. The problem that haunted him now was not dramatic, but it was relentless. Firewood, not the lack of it. Frank always worked hard enough in summer to split and stack more than most, but its condition. Wet wood. The previous winter had been a lesson written in smoke and pain. He remembered standing over his stove, coughing until his chest burned, eyes watering as damp logs hissed and steamed instead of burning clean. He remembered the creosote choking his chimney faster than he could clean it, the constant fear of fire or suffocation. Wet firewood did not warm a house. It robbed heat, stole energy, and demanded more labor at the worst possible time. Frank understood this with the clarity of a man who had lived consequences rather than theories. Inside the house, Bear lifted his head as Frank shifted his weight. Bear was an 11-year-old German shepherd, large even by the breed's standards, though age had softened him. His coat was dark brown and black, thick and weatherproof, with a muzzle gone noticeably gray. His hips were stiff in the mornings, and he rose carefully now, but his ears remained alert, and his dark eyes missed very little. Bear had been with Frank since he was a pup, adopted shortly after Frank's wife passed, and over the years the dog had become less a pet and more a quiet presence that anchored the house. Bear did not bark unless there was reason. He watched. He waited. He listened. Frank stepped back into the kitchen and looked down at the worn wooden floorboards. Beneath them was earth. Cold, stable earth that did not care about wind or rain or freeze-thaw cycles. The idea had been forming in his mind for months, drawn not from innovation, but memory. During his service years, Frank had seen supply caches buried deep enough to remain dry and usable while the world above turned hostile. Earth held temperature. Earth absorbed moisture if guided correctly. Earth did not argue. When Frank began digging beneath his house, he did it the same way he had approached everything important in his life, quietly and without asking permission. He measured twice before lifting the shovel. He offset his work from the foundation, careful not to undermine what already stood. Each shovelful of soil was lifted with deliberate rhythm, breath controlled, movements efficient despite the ache that spread through his shoulders. Bear watched from the edge of the growing hole, nose dipping toward the dirt, ears twitching when soil shifted. When loose earth crumbled unexpectedly, Bear gave a low warning sound, and Frank paused, hand resting on the shovel handle, acknowledging the alert with a small nod. It did not take long for the neighbors to notice. In a place like Duluth, people noticed anything that broke routine. A man digging beneath his own house was not routine. One afternoon, a voice drifted across the cold air, thick with amusement. "That old man's lost it," someone said. Frank did not look up. He had heard worse judgments in louder places. Laughter followed, the kind that carried more comfort for the speaker than cruelty toward the target. Among those watching was Tom Hargreaves, a stocky man in his early 50s with broad shoulders and a thick beard that trapped snowflakes like wire. Tom worked at the docks and wore heavy jackets stained by years of labor. He laughed easily and spoke loudly, the kind of man who trusted what had always worked because it had always worked for him. To Tom, Frank's hole looked like foolishness courting disaster. A little farther back stood Sarah Whitman, a tall, slender woman of 63 with pale skin weathered by wind and years' of factory shifts. Her gray hair was tied back neatly in a low bun, and her eyes were sharp, observant rather than mocking. Sarah had lost her husband years earlier and lived alone now, accustomed to watching carefully before forming opinions. She did not laugh. She simply frowned, concern creasing her brow, hands tucked deep into the pockets of her long wool coat. Frank was aware of all of them without acknowledging any of them. His focus remained on the work, on the feel of the earth, on the shape of the space forming beneath his home. He was not angry at the laughter. Anger wasted energy, and energy was something winter demanded you manage carefully. What he felt instead was a familiar calm, the same calm that had settled over him before difficult operations long ago. Let them talk, The cold would answer in time. As daylight faded and the wind rose again, Frank climbed out of the hole and brushed dirt from his gloves. Bear followed him inside, positioning himself near the kitchen floor, eyes still tracking the opening. Frank stood for a long moment, listening to the wind scrape along the siding, thinking of the winter ahead. He did not know yet exactly how the chamber would take shape, only that it must. This was not defiance. It was necessity. That night, as snow began to fall again, heavy, wet flakes that melted on contact before freezing hard, Frank sat at the small kitchen table, sketching simple lines and slopes on scrap paper. Bear lay nearby, head on his paws, watching the pencil move. Outside, the laughter faded with the light, replaced by the low howl of wind off Lake Superior. Frank did not smile. He did not doubt. Somewhere beneath the floorboards, a solution waited to be uncovered, and winter, as always, was already on its way. Frank Miller did not dig blindly. Every movement followed a quiet order learned decades earlier, when mistakes in cold places cost more than pride. The shovel rose and fell with measured rhythm, his boots planted firmly in the frozen ground beneath the kitchen floor, his breathing steady despite the ache in his shoulders. He worked offset from the foundation, careful not to undermine the weight-bearing beams, measuring twice before removing another layer of earth. The discipline was not showy. It lived in restraint, in knowing when to stop for the day even when the body could push further. Frank had learned that lesson the hard way during a winter training exercise years ago, when exhaustion had caused a fellow soldier to misjudge a footing and shatter his ankle on ice. Since then, Frank trusted patience more than strength. Bear stayed close, as he always did. The old German shepherd positioned himself near the edge of the growing pit, broad chest rising and falling, ears alert. His muzzle hovered over the hole, nostrils flaring as if reading the earth itself. At times he whined softly when loose soil crumbled, and Frank would pause, resting both hands on the shovel handle, letting the dog settle before continuing. Bear had slowed with age, his hips stiff in the morning, but his instincts were intact. Frank respected that. In the army, he had learned to listen to warnings that didn't speak in words. As days passed, the pit became a chamber. Frank laid a thick bed of coarse gravel at the bottom, each bucket hauled by hand, sweat freezing along his temples despite the cold. The gravel was not an afterthought. It was the heart of the design. Water had to move downward and away, never lingering. Over that, he stacked fieldstone collected from the edge of his property, stones scarred and rounded by years of ice and melt, fitting them together without mortar, leaving no straight seams for pressure to exploit. Above the stone, he framed the upper walls with split timber, sealing gaps with packed clay while leaving narrow ventilation slots positioned opposite each other. Small, deliberate openings, enough to breathe, not enough to invite snow. Word spread faster than Frank expected. Duluth was not a small town when it came to noise, but it was small when it came to attention. One afternoon, while Frank was adjusting the angle of a timber brace, a woman stood at the open doorway watching him work. Her name was Sarah Whitman, a widow in her early 60s who lived 2 houses down. She was tall and slender, her posture upright despite years of factory work that had stiffened her hands. Her hair, once auburn, had faded to a pale gray she wore pulled back in a low knot, and her skin bore the fine lines of someone who had spent much of her life near wind and water. Sarah was not loud like Tom Hargreaves. Her concern showed in her eyes, pale blue and observant, the kind that weighed consequences before forming opinions. "You're going deep, Frank," she said quietly, hands tucked into the pockets of her long wool coat. "People are talking." Frank nodded without looking up. "They usually do." Sarah hesitated, then stepped closer, peering into the chamber. "My husband tried something like this once. Not under the house. Beside it. Poor drainage. It flooded in spring. Ruined everything." Her voice softened at the memory. Not accusatory. Just worn. Frank straightened slowly, wiping his hands on his flannel. "Beside the house collects water. Under it, if you slope it right, sends water away." She studied him for a moment, perhaps seeing not a stubborn old man, but someone measuring risks he understood. "I hope you're right," she said finally. "Winter's been unforgiving these past few years." Then she nodded to Bear, who watched her with calm suspicion and left without another word. Not everyone was as restrained. Tom Hargreaves returned more than once, always with a grin and a comment meant to draw an audience. He stood broad and solid, arms like dock ropes, beard thick and unruly, the kind of man who laughed loudly and trusted what had always worked. "You planning to live down there too, Frank?" he called one morning. "Might be warmer than your stove when that thing floods." Frank did not answer. He had learned long ago that explaining a plan too early invited interference. The work spoke better for itself when finished. Inside the house, Frank cut a square in the kitchen floor, reinforcing the opening with doubled joists scavenged from an old shed. The trapdoor fit snugly, lined underneath with scraps of insulation and canvas, heavy enough to seal when closed. When he lowered a ladder through the opening for the first time, Bear leaned forward, peering down into the dim space, tail giving a slow, uncertain wag. Frank climbed down carefully, boots crunching on gravel, and for the first time stood fully upright inside the chamber. It smelled of earth and stone, cool but not damp. He exhaled, a sound halfway between relief and resolve. The secondary tunnel took longer. Frank dug it toward the downhill side of the property, carving a narrow passage just tall enough for a man to crouch through. Each scoop of soil was tested, each wall braced. The ceiling sloped slightly to discourage any drifting moisture. At the exit, he built a low door angled southeast, recalling how snow drifted with prevailing winds. Bear waited at the mouth of the tunnel the first time Frank emerged, barking once a sharp, approving sound. By late autumn, the chamber was ready. Frank began stacking firewood underground, split pine and birch carried through the tunnel, placed carefully to allow air to move between rows. His back ached, his hands cracked, but there was satisfaction in the order of it. Outside, neighbors watched him disappear beneath his own house and reappear with arms empty, shaking their heads. Some laughed, some frowned. A few said nothing, which Frank counted as a small victory. At night, Frank sat at the kitchen table, listening to the wind rise off Lake Superior, its low howl vibrating through the walls. Bear lay near the trapdoor, head resting on his paws, eyes half closed but alert. Frank thought of winter coming, of freeze and thaw, of the way moisture crept into places it wasn't wanted. He also thought of the years he had spent trusting systems that worked only when built with care. The hissing laughter outside did not trouble him as much as it once might have. He had lived through louder storms. The first light snow dusted the ground a week later. Frank opened the trapdoor, climbed down, and ran his hand over the stacked wood. It was dry, not warm, not soft dry. He climbed back up, closed the door, and for the first time allowed himself a small, private smile. Outside, the town still thought the hole beneath his house was madness. Frank knew better. Winter would decide soon enough. January arrived in Duluth without ceremony, only wait. Snow fell thick and wet, carried sideways by wind off Lake Superior, that smelled faintly of iron and cold water. It wasn't the clean, dry kind of snow that squeaked under boots. This snow clung. It soaked. It pressed itself into every crack and seam before melting just enough to sink deeper, then freezing again into something heavy and unyielding. Frank Miller watched it happen from his kitchen window, mug of weak coffee warming his hands, his red and black flannel hanging open over a gray thermal shirt, worn thin at the elbows. He had seen winters like this before, not here exactly, but close enough to know what followed. Freeze, thaw, rot, desperation. Across the neighborhood, the signs came quickly. Outdoor woodpiles that had been stacked with pride in October were now hunched under sagging tarps, the fabric stiff with ice, corners torn loose by wind. Smoke rose from chimneys in thick gray columns instead of the clean blue threads that meant dry fuel. Smoke that stung the eyes even from a distance. Smoke that told a story Frank knew too well. Wet wood hisses. It fights fire. It steals heat before giving anything back. Bear sensed the change before the worst of it arrived. The old German shepherd paced more than usual, nails clicking softly against the floorboards, pausing often near the trapdoor in the kitchen, as if checking that it was still there. His movements were slower now, hips stiff, but his awareness sharpened as the storm intensified. At night, when the wind battered the house hard enough to make the walls groan, Bear lifted his head and listened, ears twitching, then settled again only when Frank's boots appeared beside him. The dog trusted the rhythm of his owner's presence more than the sounds outside. By mid-January, the thaw came. A warm front pushed temperatures briefly above freezing, turning streets into rivers of slush and yards into fields of dark, wet snow. Water ran everywhere it could find a path. It soaked into stacked logs, crept under tarps, pooled beneath lean-tos. Then, just as suddenly, the temperature plunged. Overnight, the slush locked into ice. Woodpiles froze solid. Individual logs fused together by moisture turned to stone. The first knock came 2 mornings later. Frank opened the door to find Tom Hargreaves standing on the porch, shoulders hunched against the cold, beard crusted with frost. The man looked different now, still broad, still loud by nature, but his eyes were rimmed red, and his usual grin was gone. "Morning," Tom said, voice rough. "You wouldn't happen to have a little dry kindling to spare, would you?" He shifted his weight, embarrassed but too cold to hide it well. "My pile's, well, it's useless." Frank studied him for a moment. He didn't feel satisfaction, only recognition. He handed Tom a small bundle of dry splits from beside the stove. "That'll get you started," he said. Nothing more. Tom nodded, muttered thanks, and left quickly, as if afraid more words would cost him pride. Frank closed the door and stood for a moment, listening to the wind. He did not feel vindicated. Not yet. Winter wasn't finished. 2 houses down, Sarah Whitman struggled quietly. Frank noticed her chimney smoked heavily, then went dark for hours at a time. One afternoon, as snow fell again thicker this time, Frank saw her through the window, bundled in a long coat, chopping at a frozen woodpile with movements too stiff for the task. She was tall but slight, and age had thinned her strength more than she liked to admit. Her hair, always neatly tied back, had strands escaping now, whipped loose by the wind. Frank pulled on his boots and coat, Bear following close, and walked over without announcing himself. "You'll hurt yourself," he said calmly, taking the axe from her hands before she could protest. Sarah exhaled sharply, frustration and fatigue plain on her face. "Everything's wet," she said. "I thought I'd stacked it right." Frank split a log cleanly. The inside was dark and damp. He shook his head. "Come warm up," he said. She hesitated only a second before nodding. Inside Frank's house, the contrast was immediate. The air was warm, steady, without the acrid bite of wet smoke. Sarah stopped just inside the doorway, shoulders relaxing, as if she hadn't realized how tense she'd been. Bear watched her carefully, then lay back down near the hearth. Frank opened the trapdoor, climbed down, and returned with an armload of wood. The logs were pale, dry, smelling faintly of resin. Sarah's eyes widened. "You weren't exaggerating," she said softly. That night, the real storm arrived. Snow fell for 2 days straight, driven hard against the north sides of houses, piling into drifts taller than fences. Power flickered, then failed across parts of the city. Temperatures dropped into the teens below zero. The sound of axes rang out at all hours as people tried to break apart frozen piles, only to find damp wood inside. Some burned old chairs, warped shelves, even sections of fence. Chimneys clogged. Smoke backed into living rooms. Children slept in coats, breath visible in the air. Frank opened the trapdoor once more. The chamber below was unchanged. Cool, dry, stable. He carried wood up in measured loads, feeding the stove without urgency. The fire caught immediately, burned clean, and held through the night. Frank slept in his chair for a while, boots still on, Bear stretched out on the rug, the dog's chest rising and falling in deep, contented breaths. Outside, the storm screamed. Inside, there was only warmth and the soft crackle of burning wood. In the early hours before dawn, Frank woke to an unfamiliar silence. The wind had dropped. Snow lay heavy and still against the windows. He stirred the fire and watched the flames respond, steady and obedient. For the first time since the digging began, he allowed himself to acknowledge the truth fully. The system was working. Not in theory, not in hope, in reality. By morning, word had spread without anyone needing to say it aloud. Frank's chimney still smoked cleanly, while others struggled to relight dead fires. People noticed. They always did when survival was involved. Tom passed by again, this time slower, eyes lingering on the house. Sarah waved once from her porch, wrapped in a borrowed scarf, her expression something close to relief. Frank raised a hand in return and went back inside. Bear settled again by the hearth, sighing as warmth soaked into his old bones. Frank rested his hand on the dog's head and stared into the fire. Outside, the town endured. Inside, the experiment had passed its first trial. Winter had tested the hole beneath his house, and it had not failed. By late winter, the cold had lost its roar, but not its grip. Duluth stood wrapped in a tired gray, snowbanks shrinking by inches during the day and refreezing into glassy ridges at night. The wind off Lake Superior softened, carrying the smell of thawing earth and rusted iron from the harbor, but it still cut sharply when it turned. Frank Miller felt the shift in his bones before he saw it outside. The ache in his knee eased slightly on warmer afternoons, then returned when dusk pulled temperatures back down. Winter wasn't finished, but it was weakening, and that was when the truth had room to surface. The difference between Frank's house and the others had grown too obvious to ignore. His chimney released a thin, steady ribbon of pale smoke while neighboring stacks belched thick gray clouds that clung to the air. His windows stayed clear, free of frost creeping along the glass. Inside, the warmth was even, the kind that settled into walls and furniture rather than spiking and fading. Frank had burned far less wood than he ever had in previous years, and he knew it without counting every log. The pile in the chamber beneath his kitchen remained orderly and full, the ends of the splits still light in color, still dry to the touch. Bear noticed the visitors before Frank did. The old German shepherd had learned the cadence of the neighborhood, who walked with purpose, who wandered, who came only to look. When footsteps lingered near the house now, Bear lifted his head and rose, tail moving slowly instead of stiffening. That was how Frank knew the curiosity had shifted from ridicule to something closer to respect. The first to ask directly was a man named Harold Knox, a retired surveyor who lived closer to the bluff overlooking the lake. Harold was in his late 60s, lean and angular, his face etched with deep lines that spoke of long days outdoors. He wore wire-rimmed glasses that slid down a narrow nose and kept his gray beard trimmed short, a habit from years when precision had mattered. Harold was not loud like Tom Hargreaves had been. He was deliberate, careful, the kind of man who asked questions only after observing quietly for a long time. He arrived one afternoon while the sun softened the snow just enough to make the ground slick. Frank opened the door to find him standing straight-backed despite the cold, hands folded around a notebook that looked nearly as old as Frank's flannel. "I won't waste your time," Harold said. "I've been watching. Your house holds heat better. Your chimney's cleaner. And during the thaw last week, I saw water run down your slope instead of pooling." He paused, eyes steady. "I'd like to know how you did it." Frank considered him for a moment, then stepped aside. "Come in," he said simply. Inside, Harold took in the room with a surveyor's eye, noting angles, airflow, the position of the stove relative to the walls. Frank lifted the trap door and led him down the ladder. Harold moved carefully, testing each rung, then stood quietly in the chamber, breathing in. "Dry," he murmured. He knelt to touch the gravel floor, brushed his fingers against the stone wall. "You trusted gravity," he said, more statement than question. Frank nodded. "And patience." When Harold left, his expression had changed. Not amazement. Acceptance. The kind that came when numbers aligned with reality. He did not tell anyone right away, but the shift in his demeanor spread faster than words. The thaw intensified in March. Snow melted in sheets, water running hard across yards and into the streets. This was the moment many had waited for, the failure they were certain would come. Frank watched from his window as water streamed downhill behind his house, following the shallow channel he had cut months earlier. He checked the chamber twice a day. The gravel bed remained firm. The air stayed cool and dry. The wood did not darken. The walls did not weep moisture. Nothing sagged. Nothing shifted. Sarah Whitman came by again, this time with a small basket of bread she had baked in gratitude for the help earlier in the winter. She looked stronger now. Color returned to her cheeks, her posture less guarded. "It didn't flood," she said, not as a question. Frank shook his head. She smiled, a quiet, relieved curve of the lips. "I thought so." Tom Hargreaves passed less often, but when he did, he no longer joked. He nodded once, gruffly, eyes lingering on the slope behind Frank's house where the meltwater disappeared without fuss. Pride took longer to thaw than snow. One evening, as dusk settled and the air cooled again, Frank sat at the kitchen table, sharpening a knife he didn't really need to sharpen. Bear lay nearby, chin on his paws, eyes following the steady movement of Frank's hands. The house was calm, warm in a way that felt earned. Frank thought about how little he had explained himself through the winter, how he had let outcomes do the talking. It reminded him of something an old sergeant had once said after a grueling exercise. "Don't argue with the weather. Prepare for it." A small group gathered one afternoon near the end of the month, Harold, Sarah, and two others from farther down the street. They stood awkwardly at first, unsure how to begin. Harold cleared his throat. "We're not here to criticize," he said. "We're here to understand." Frank showed them the chamber. He spoke plainly. No diagrams, no grand claims. Offset from the foundation, drainage first, airflow controlled, not blocked, access that respected winter instead of fighting it. He did not present it as innovation. He presented it as sense. Bear watched from the top of the ladder, tail swaying slowly, as if approving the exchange. When they left, the yard felt different, quieter, not empty, but settled. Frank closed the trapdoor and leaned against the counter, feeling a weariness that was not unpleasant. He had carried the weight of doubt all winter, not loudly, but steadily. Now it lifted. That night, Frank lit the stove with a single match. The flame caught cleanly, spreading warmth through the room. Bear rose, stretched stiff legs, and circled twice before settling closer to the hearth. Frank rested his boots near the heat and stared into the fire. Outside, the town continued its slow thaw, learning what had already been proven beneath his house. Inside, there was no need for explanation. The truth had spoken in warmth, in dryness, in the quiet endurance of a winter that had finally loosened its hold. The following winter did not announce itself with drama, but with intention. Duluth cooled slowly that year, autumn stretching longer than usual, leaves clinging stubbornly to branches, as if reluctant to surrender. Frank Miller noticed the change while splitting wood in the yard. His red and black buffalo-plaid flannel darkened at the cuffs from years of use. Sleeves rolled just enough to reveal forearms roped with old muscle and pale scars. Age had thinned him, but not softened him. His movements were slower now, measured, yet confident, shaped by a life that had taught him to conserve energy rather than waste it. Bear sat nearby, older still, muzzle nearly white now, body heavy with years but eyes alert, tracking every sound as if winter itself might try something new this time. By November, the ground had hardened again, and something else had changed with it. Frank was no longer the only one digging. 2 houses down, Sarah Whitman's yard bore fresh scars of turned earth. She worked carefully, her tall, slender frame wrapped in a long brown coat, gray hair tucked beneath a knit cap. Sarah's hands were steady but cautious, her movements thoughtful. She had spent her life adapting after loss, and that had shaped her into someone who watched closely before acting. Her chamber was smaller than Frank's, built beside her kitchen rather than beneath it, but the principles were the same. Gravel for drainage, stone for stability, airflow respected, not sealed away. Frank had not drawn her plans. He had only answered questions when asked. Farther down the street, Harold Knox supervised quietly as his nephew dug a narrow cellar offset from the foundation. Harold, thin and sharp-featured, stood with his notebook tucked under one arm, glasses glinting in the pale sun. He did not lift a shovel himself, his knees would not allow it, but he measured slopes and angles with the same precision that had once defined his career as a surveyor. He spoke little, but when he did, people listened. His presence lent legitimacy to what had once been dismissed as foolish. Even Tom Hargreaves joined in, though he would never say it outright. His version was rougher, dug with more force than patience, but Frank noticed something important. Tom followed the slope downhill, not toward the house. Pride had not vanished, but it had learned. No one called it Frank's idea. No one said his name aloud when they talked about it, and Frank preferred it that way. He did not want ownership. He wanted continuity. In the Army, survival techniques were never named after the man who first used them. They were passed down quietly, stripped of ego, because ego had no place in cold places. The first snow came early again, light at first, then heavier, wetter. The freeze-thaw cycle returned as predictably as breath. This time, though, the neighborhood responded differently. Wood disappeared underground before the worst storms arrived. Tarps were used less, chimneys smoked cleaner, The air smelled sharper, less choked with damp ash. Frank watched from his window one evening as lights flickered on across the street, warm yellow squares glowing behind clear glass. He felt no triumph, only a sense of alignment, as if something had quietly corrected itself. Inside his own home, little had changed. The trapdoor still fit snugly in the kitchen floor, edges worn smooth by boots and hands. The ladder creaked the same way it always had. The chamber below remained cool and dry, wood stacked neatly, ends pale and ready. Frank moved through the space with familiarity now, like a man walking a well-known path. His body remembered every step. His hands found each log without thought. Bear, slower now, no longer followed him down. Instead, the old dog stationed himself beside the trapdoor, lying with his body angled just enough to block the draft, head resting on crossed paws. His breathing had grown heavier over the past year, each rise and fall of his chest deliberate. Frank noticed the stiffness in Bear's joints, the way the dog took longer to stand, the careful testing of weight before committing to movement. Age had arrived for both of them, not suddenly, but insistently. One evening in December, after the first real storm of the season passed, Frank sat in his chair by the stove, hands wrapped around a mug he did not drink from anymore. The fire burned steady, fed by dry wood lifted from below with ease. Bear lay nearby, eyes half closed, ears flicking occasionally at distant sounds. Outside, wind moved through the neighborhood, but it did not howl the way it had before. It slipped past houses that were better prepared, finding fewer weaknesses to exploit. Frank thought back to the laughter, to the first shovel of earth, to the way doubt had hung in the air heavier than snow. He had not argued then, and he would not explain now. The truth had never needed his voice. It had needed time. Late in January, Frank noticed something else. He was splitting less wood, not because he had grown weaker, but because he did not need to rush. His supply lasted longer. His movements were calmer. Survival no longer demanded urgency. That, more than warmth, felt like the real gift. One afternoon, a young couple from 3 streets over stopped by. The man was tall and broad-shouldered, beard still patchy with youth, hands rough from construction work. The woman beside him was shorter, dark-haired, bundled tightly against the cold, her eyes bright with curiosity. They did not ask how Frank built his chamber. They asked why. Frank considered the question longer than the answer required. "Because winter doesn't negotiate," he said, "and neither should you." They thanked him and left, and Frank knew the idea would travel again, carried not by instruction, but by observation. As February deepened, Bear's age became impossible to ignore. He slept more, rose slower, stayed closer to the warmth. Frank adjusted without thinking, keeping water closer, laying extra rugs near the hearth. One night, Bear did not move from his place by the trapdoor at all, only lifted his eyes to meet Frank's when he passed. Frank knelt beside him, resting a hand on the thick fur at the dog's neck, feeling the steady beat beneath. The position mattered. Bear had chosen it deliberately, guarding the warmth, guarding the thing that had changed everything. The winter passed without spectacle. No disaster, no headline moment, just steady warmth, dry wood, clean air. When spring finally came and the ground softened again, the chambers held. Water moved where it was told to move. Earth settled. Houses stood. Frank did not live to see the idea spread far beyond the neighborhood, but he lived long enough to see it take root. and that was enough. Beneath the cold soil of Duluth, something quiet endured, not a monument, not a name, but a way of thinking that valued patience over noise, preparation over pride. Each winter night, Bear lay by the trap door, older now, breathing slow as if listening for something only he could hear. Frank would sit nearby, firelight warming his flannel, and together they kept watch, not over danger, but over the simple, hard-earned comfort of being ready. Like soldiers long retired, guarding not territory, but peace. In the end, this story was never really about a hole in the ground or a clever way to keep firewood dry. It was about a quiet kind of miracle, the kind God often works through patience, humility, and hands willing to do the hard work no one applauds. Frank didn't wait for a miracle to fall from the sky. He prepared. And somehow, in that preparation, grace met effort. The warmth that filled his home wasn't just from dry wood. It was from wisdom, perseverance, and a trust that doing what is right will bear fruit in its season. In our own lives, we face winters too, seasons of uncertainty, scarcity, and doubt, where the old ways stop working and the noise of other people's opinions grows loud. This story reminds us that God doesn't always shout. Sometimes He guides quietly, through small ideas, steady faith, and the courage to keep going when others laugh. What you build in silence today may become the shelter that carries you and others through tomorrow's storm. If this story spoke to you, share it with someone who's walking through a hard season. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from or what winter you're facing right now. You're not alone here. And if you believe there's value in these quiet stories of resilience and faith, please subscribe to the channel so more people can find them. May God bless you and your home, keep you warm in body and spirit, and guide you through every storm ahead. May His protection rest over you and those you love. Until next time, stay prepared, stay humble, and never underestimate the power of doing the right thing quietly.